all of this relates to the teaching on emptiness that we spoke about earlier, and also it underlines the central importance of the understanding of emptiness in the Buddhist context. So the question is, why is it the real understanding of emptiness so crucial? It's because understanding of emptiness is what embodies the understanding of the Buddha's teaching on no self, anatman. And and when we talk about the teaching on no self in the context of the Mahayana schools of middle way and mind only, we are not talking about no self in the context of the no self of the person alone, but in fact the selflessness of all phenomena. So here, when we talk about the selflessness of all phenomena, we are talking about the teaching on emptiness. And so why is it that this understanding is so important for a Buddhist practitioner? Is because it pertains to dealing with states of mind and emotions that obstruct our understanding of reality, that are the source of our problem. For example, in Dharmakirti's Pramanavartika text, which is a commentary exposition of valid cognition, in this text, Dharmakirti says that so this particular text is an example of a text that does not exist in the Chinese translation, but does so in Tibetan. In this text, Dharmakirti says that when there is the notion of self, then the notion of otherness arises, and on the basis of the differentiation of self and others, then attachment and aversion arises, and from this a whole host of emotions arises. So what Dharmakirti is pointing out here is that at the root of all of our problems and misconceptions is a kind of a grasping to a certain notion of self. And in some sense, this notion of this self is truly the root and the center from which everything arises. And once we have this notion of self, and it's not just a notion of self, because on the conventional level, the distinctions between self and other does exist. There is yourself here and that others over there. But the kind of grasping at self that he's talking about is a slightly kind of a more stronger form of grasping, where the notion of the self is so strong that there is a very strong basis created for this kind of independent separation of self and other, so that once you have that notion of self, then anything that relates to the well-being of that conceived self becomes very important to you. It's your family, your friends, and your belongings, and these then become the object of your attachment. And then the otherness that has been kind of defined in contrast to yourself then becomes an object that has been objectified. Then they become objects that you are either feeling totally indifferent to, or if necessary, and if you happen to see these other coming in the way of your own fulfilling your aims, then you are even willing to be aversive towards this other. So what you find here is that on the basis of a strong differentiation between self and others and a grasping on that, then a feeling of attractiveness or attachment to something arises. And in contrast to this, a feeling of kind of aversion and unattractiveness and undesirability, notion of undesirability arises. And from this, then the whole host of emotions that arise from these two primary modalities of either being attached to or being averse to arises. So, and this is something even we can recognize from our own personal experience, because if we examine our feeling of attachment, and the object of attachment is something that we find attractive, something that we find desirable. And this desirable, the quality of desirableness is what makes us feel kind of drawn to. Similarly, when we analyze the concept of, the content of our anger or hatred towards someone, aversion towards someone, again, within that, the emotion is an object which we somehow find repulsive, aversive, and then we kind of withdraw from it. So these are something that we can even experience, identify from our own personal experience as well. And the fact that these emotions, that are aversive emotions and strong attachment, are the sources of problem of our problem is something that is recognized also in other traditions as well. For example, in the Hindu tradition, which is a classical Indian tradition, we see a lot of discussion of the destructive, natures of the strong negative emotions. So much so that we even find in the Hindu tradition practices that are aimed at curbing these extreme levels of emotions. We also see, therefore, development of deeper levels of tranquil states of mind, referred to as samadhi or meditative concentrations, all aimed at cultivating that settled, peaceful state of mind that is freed from being, kind of caught up in this aversion and attachment. We also see in other non-Indian traditions, for example, in Christianity, we find teachings on the need to avoid from cardinal sins, the principal sins, and a large part of that discussion is the need to be aware of the destructive nature of greed and lust, and practices that are aimed at dealing with them. So we find that the recognition of the importance of recognizing the destructiveness of afflictive emotions is something that we find a common theme in most of the religious teachings. So, therefore, in all of this, the Buddhist, the Mahayana Sutras are not saying that the self does not exist, that others do not exist, but it is talking about dealing with a way of conceiving the self, way of viewing the self that has this extreme attachment and grasping. So, for example, in Chandrakirti's guide to the entering the middle way, he says that seeing that all the host of afflictive emotions arise from the view of self, the yogis then take the self as the focus and understand its emptiness. So what Chandrakirti is saying here is that the grasping, the basis of the grasping is the self, but the distortion arises in the manner in which we view the self. So if we view the self to be inherently real and has this kind of inherent existence, then this is what leads to all the problems. And the teaching of emptiness is an antidote to dealing with that grasping. And one can only deal with that grasping by cultivating an insight that is totally opposite to the way in which the grasping, works. So here, dealing with the grasping itself, practices like compassion and loving kindness is not effective. You need to cultivate a wisdom that sees into the actual way, the reality of the person, and sees through the deception of the grasping. So therefore, Dharmakirti says in his Pramanavartika that given that loving kindness and compassion does not directly oppose the perspective of the grasping, they cannot act as an antidote to grasping and self. Mm-hmm. So the fact that the meditation on emptiness and the cultivation of the understanding the emptiness is important is common to both the middle way school and the mind-only school interpretation. But what constitutes the content of that wisdom? What exactly is the meaning of that emptiness? That's where the difference is between the middle way school and mind-only.
대주체 초 도미는 자네